under the bruised veil of a moonless night, Luna staggered through the wilderness like a ghost escaping its own reflection. Her body was torn and trembling, the pale prison fabric clinging to her like a cruel reminder of the walls she had just defied. Every breath scraped her throat raw. Behind her, the sound of barking dogs and shouting guards still echoed faintly, fading into the distance, but never leaving her mind. Freedom, she realized, was not a feeling of wind in her hair or stars above her. It was agony, soaked in blood and desperation. She clutched her abdomen as a sharp pain knifed through her belly. Her baby, was fighting to come too soon, far before safety, far before warmth. And yet, the world gave her no time to stop. She stumbled over roots, mud streaking her legs, whispering words of prayer she no longer believed in. It had started in the prison yard earlier that day, when the warden, a man whose cruelty was legend, had cornered her during roll call. His eyes gleamed with perverse pleasure as he leaned close, telling her in a voice soft as poison that if she didn't confess who helped her smuggle the map out, he would make sure she never carried another child again. The words had frozen her soul. Luna had been many things, reckless, proud, naive, but at that moment, she was only a mother, terrified beyond words. When the riot broke out that evening, it wasn't courage that pushed her through the chaos. It was terror, a primal instinct to protect the fragile life inside her. She ran while alarms blared, through smoke, through screams, through gunfire. And now, hours later, her body was failing her. The shock, the exhaustion, and the relentless pounding of fear converged into one unbearable truth. The baby was coming. The storm that gathered over the coast seemed to mock her pain. The sky tore open with rain as she crawled into a crumbling warehouse near the sea, its windows shattered, its walls breathing with salt and rot. There, surrounded by the ghosts of forgotten machinery, Luna collapsed. The contractions came like waves, tearing her apart. She bit down on the sleeve of her uniform to muffle her screams. Every push felt like surrendering another piece of her soul. She remembered her mother's lullaby, fragments of warmth from a time before the Nozawa name became a curse. Between flashes of lightning, she saw her reflection in a puddle, eyes wide, lips pale, a woman unrecognizable even to herself. Hours blurred into eternity until at last, a cry pierced the darkness, a fragile sound, trembling but alive. The baby was impossibly small, pink and trembling, her chest rising with delicate effort. Luna stared at her child, a flood of emotions swallowing her whole, love so fierce it felt like pain, guilt so heavy it felt like drowning. She knew she could not keep her. The world would devour a child born of both Nozawa blood and Spencer legacy. The same people who branded Luna a murderer would destroy this child, too. The Spencers would see scandal, the Nozawas would see shame. But maybe, just maybe one man, Bill, might see a child instead of a weapon. Bill Spencer, who once looked at Luna with a mixture of fascination and regret, who once told her that strength was not the absence of fear, but the will to defy it. He had power, resources, and a heart that, despite its armor, had shown mercy when no one else did. With trembling hands, Luna wrapped the baby in her prison shirt, the black serial numbers still visible. She pressed her lips to the infant's forehead, tasting salt and sorrow. She found a scrap of paper in her pocket, an old receipt from the prison laundry. With shaking fingers, she scrawled the only words her fading strength could manage. "Don't let her become me. Please protect her from the darkness of Nozawa and Spencer." The ink smeared under falling tears. She folded the note and tucked it inside the baby's cloth. Then, clutching the small bundle to her chest, Luna pushed herself to her feet and staggered out into the storm. The road to the Spencer mansion was long and merciless. Her vision blurred from blood loss, every step a battle between instinct and collapse. By the time she reached the iron gates, dawn was bleeding into the horizon. The world felt suspended between night and light, an hour that belonged to lost souls. She crept through the garden, her breath visible in the cold air, until she reached the front door. Her hands trembled violently as she placed the bundle on the welcome mat. The baby whimpered softly, a sound that sliced through her heart. Luna knelt beside her daughter, pressing one last kiss to her cheek before whispering a silent promise, one the child would never hear but might one day feel in the marrow of her bones. "I am not gone. I am the wind that guards you." She pressed the doorbell and stumbled backward into the shadows. Through the rain-smeared glass, she saw the door open. Bill appeared first, his expression sharp with confusion, then softening into shock as he noticed the child. Katie followed, her gasp lost in the thunder. Luna watched from the darkness as they lifted the baby into their arms. For the briefest moment, peace washed over her, because in their eyes, she saw not horror, but wonder. It was enough. When she turned to leave, her strength finally deserted her. She walked toward the cliffs overlooking the sea, the same cliffs where, years ago, she and Bill once stood at sunset, speaking of futures that could never be. Now the tide below roared like judgment. The authorities would come soon. They would call her dangerous, deranged. They would chase her down, and the truth of the baby's birth would be twisted until the child herself became a target. There was only one way left to protect her. Luna stood at the edge, the wind tearing through her hair, her body trembling not from fear but from release. She closed her eyes and thought of the baby's cry, the sound of life, pure and uncorrupted. Then, with a final breath, she stepped forward. The fall was silent. The sea accepted her like a mother receiving a lost child. The investigation that followed was quick and perfunctory. The report said she slipped while fleeing arrest. The prison staff spoke of her madness, of delusions and violence. But the audience, the world that watched from afar, knew better. They saw not a criminal, but a woman who traded her own life for a fragment of her child's peace. Luna had not fallen. She had chosen. Her death was not an escape, but an offering. At the Spencer estate, the mystery child became the center of whispered rumors. The note was kept secret, known only to Bill and Katie. The name Nozawa carried too much danger, too much history. In public, she was simply Hope, a name Katie gave her for the life she symbolized. Bill would spend countless nights standing by her crib, the faint echo of Luna's name tangled with the sound of the waves outside. He never spoke of that night, but he felt her presence in every gust of wind, every storm that battered the cliffs. Years later, when Hope grew old enough to ask where she came from, Bill's silence would ache louder than any lie. The truth, buried beneath grief and guilt, would live on in fragments, in the way she tilted her head when deep in thought, in the quiet fire behind her eyes, in the stubborn courage that ran in her veins. And somewhere beyond the cliffs, in the restless sea, the spirit of Luna would linger, watching, mourning, but at peace, because her sacrifice had not been in vain. For Luna Nozawa, redemption did not come in the form of forgiveness or freedom. It came in the fragile heartbeat of a newborn who would never know the chains her mother broke to save her. And in that fleeting moment, between the terror of life and the mercy of death, Luna finally became what she had always longed to be, a protector, a mother, and a ghost who loved too fiercely to let go. The scream shattered the silence of the Spencer mansion. It wasn't the cry of a child, it was Will's. The echo carried down the marble hallways, sharp and trembling, until it struck the heart of the house and drew Bill and Katie running from the east wing. The front door stood open against the night, the storm outside still whispering through the threshold. Will was frozen in the foyer, Electra beside him, both pale as porcelain. At their feet lay a small bundle wrapped in a coarse gray cloth, the kind used in prison uniforms, its fabric damp from the mist, its folds barely moving with the soft, rhythmic sound of a baby's breath. For a moment, the world held still. Bill's eyes widened. Katie pressed her hand to her mouth. Then the cry came, thin, desperate, new. The baby's wail sliced through the air like a confession, pulling every ghost in that house out of hiding. The note came later, discovered tucked into the folds of the cloth, smeared by water and tears, but still legible enough to chill them all. Don't let her become me. Please protect her from the darkness of Nozawa and Spencer. The handwriting trembled, but the message was unmistakable, Luna. That name hung in the air like a curse. The police confirmed it within hours. The faint fingerprint pressed into the corner of the note matched Luna Nozawa. The woman who had haunted Will's nightmares, who had broken him and then vanished behind bars, was dead, or so they believed. She had fallen from the cliffs near the sea during her escape. The official report said accidental death, but the undercurrent of tragedy was heavier than any official truth could contain. Will sat in the living room, staring at the sleeping infant now wrapped in a Spencer blanket. The baby's face was fragile and peaceful, but to him, every breath she took was a ghost whispering his name. He couldn't look at her without feeling the weight of that night years ago, the night Luna had cornered him, the night that destroyed the boy he had been and left behind a man built on guilt and disgust. Now the DNA that tied them together felt like a chain. He couldn't bear it. He couldn't bear her eyes, her skin, her existence. She was Luna's legacy, his curse made flesh. Electra sat beside him, her hand trembling as it brushed his arm, but he didn't feel comfort. She whispered that maybe this was fate, that the universe had brought the child to them for a reason, but her voice was hollow, a plea more than a belief. Deep down, even she was afraid. Because every time the baby cried, she too felt Luna breathing again. Alive in the echoes, alive in the sound of life that shouldn't have been possible. When the police left and the mansion fell back into uneasy quiet, Bill took charge. His voice was low, but firm, the same tone he used when closing a deal that cost him his soul. He said they couldn't send the baby away. He said the Spencers had made too many mistakes already, mistakes with fathers and sons, with greed and neglect. This is our chance to make it right, he said, looking down at the child as though she carried the possibility of redemption. To him, she wasn't Luna's curse. She was a test of mercy. Bill had lived a lifetime building empires and losing people along the way. Maybe this was how he could make peace with the ghosts that trailed behind him. But to Will, the words were unbearable. To raise her, to keep her under their roof, was to live every day with the face of his trauma staring back at him. She's not family, he whispered hoarsely. She's evidence. Katie said nothing at first. She stood by the fireplace, arms crossed, eyes flickering between her son and her husband. She could feel the crack forming beneath their feet. Will's sanity was fragile enough. She'd spent months helping him piece himself back together after Luna's arrest. He still woke in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, sometimes screaming, sometimes gasping for breath. How could he heal with this constant reminder? But when she looked at Bill, she saw something equally dangerous, a man desperate for salvation. The child had become a mirror reflecting every regret he'd ever buried, his failures as a father, the moral erosion that came with his power, the way he'd turned love into ownership and family into strategy. To him, this baby was the one pure thing left in the wreckage. Katie's heart ached because she understood both men, and yet they were hurtling toward a collision that would break them all. Days turned into weeks, but the tension never eased. The baby was given a temporary name, Grace, though Will refused to use it. Electra tried to help, feeding her, singing lullabies, pretending everything was normal, but even she couldn't hide the tremor in her hands. Sometimes, when she held the baby, she swore she saw Luna's eyes staring back at her. Other nights, she'd find Will sitting in the nursery doorway, silent, his expression unreadable. He never touched the child, but he never left her side either. There was a magnetic pull, love and revulsion entwined in one unbearable thread. And every time she cried, his body would tense, as if waiting for Luna's voice to rise out of the sound. The media soon caught wind of Luna's death. Convicted manipulator dies during prison escape, the headlines read. Nozawa legacy ends in tragedy. But Will couldn't believe it. He knew Luna too well. She was too cunning, too proud to simply fall. He replayed the details in his mind. The storm, the cliffs, the lack of witnesses. What if it wasn't an accident? What if she jumped? What if she'd meant for the baby to survive? The thought tore through him like lightning. He remembered how she used to say, "You can't escape blood, Will. It finds you." Now it had. One night, unable to bear it any longer, Will confronted his father. Bill was in the nursery, cradling the baby as though she were made of light. The old mogul's expression was softer than Will had ever seen, almost tender. It enraged him. "You think this makes you a better man?" he snapped, his voice shaking. "You think raising her erases what you did to us?" Bill's face hardened, the softness replaced by something colder. He told Will that some things in life weren't about blame, they were about responsibility. "You're not the only one she hurt," Bill said quietly. "But we can choose not to pass that hurt on." The words should have sounded noble, but to Will they were poison. Because no matter how his father framed it, he still had to wake up every day knowing that Luna's blood ran in that child, and that half of it was his. Electra tried to mediate, but she was unraveling too. Her love for Will was being devoured by fear, fear that he might break, fear that she might lose him to his own guilt, fear that the baby's presence would rot their relationship from the inside. She'd seen him flinch when the child reached for him. She'd heard him whisper apologies in his sleep, not to her, but to Luna. There was no jealousy in her heart anymore, only dread. Because Luna, even in death, was winning. She had found a way to stay. Katie, caught in the crossfire, grew increasingly protective of both Will and the baby. Her maternal instinct warred with logic. She didn't want the child in the house, yet she couldn't bring herself to abandon her either. Sometimes, late at night, she'd sit by the crib and stroke the baby's hand, wondering if there was innocence left untouched by sin. But every time she looked at Will, she saw the same torment. He was losing himself. The therapist said trauma had a way of finding its reflection, that sometimes healing required confronting what we fear most. But how could she ask her son to love what symbolized his deepest violation? As the months passed, the illusion of stability fractured. Will began to withdraw, his once bright ambition replaced by hollow silence. He stopped painting, stopped going out. He couldn't stand the sound of laughter, even Electra's. When he looked in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. The guilt was suffocating. Luna's death haunted him, replaying in his mind like an unanswered question. He remembered her letters from prison, pleas for forgiveness he never opened, calls he never returned. What if she'd reached out one last time before she escaped? What if his refusal to hear her drove her to the cliffs? Each thought bled into the next until he couldn't tell where her sins ended and his began. Then came the storm, the one that mirrored the night she died. Thunder rolled over the sea, lightning flashing across the windows like camera bulbs capturing their unraveling. Will stood by the nursery window, the baby asleep in her crib. Outside, the ocean roared like a living thing. Electra found him there, his hand trembling on the glass. He turned to her, eyes hollow. "Do you hear her?" he asked. "She's out there." Electra wanted to tell him it was just the wind, but when she opened her mouth, she heard it too, a faint echo, almost a whisper, carried on the storm. It was impossible, irrational, but undeniable. The sound of a woman's voice, distant yet near, calling something between a name and a warning. By morning, the storm had passed. The baby stirred, smiling faintly in her sleep. Bill walked into the room, exhausted but resolute. He announced that he'd filed paperwork to become the child's legal guardian. "She stays," he said simply. Katie's protest died on her lips when she saw the finality in his eyes. Will didn't speak. He simply walked out, rainwater still dripping from his hair, and disappeared into the dawn. Weeks later, his car was found parked near the same cliffs where Luna had fallen. He wasn't there. The note he left was short, almost identical to Luna's. "Don't let her become me." Bill stood at the edge, the paper trembling in his hand, realizing too late that the curse had come full circle. In trying to save his family, he'd condemned it to repeat the same tragedy. The baby, silent now, was the last witness to a cycle that began long before she was born, a cycle of love, control, guilt, and redemption twisted beyond recognition. Years would pass before anyone could speak of that night without breaking down. Electra left the mansion soon after, unable to breathe under the weight of Luna's shadow. Katie devoted herself to raising the child, though sometimes, when she looked into the girl's eyes, she saw both Will and Luna staring back. Bill grew older, quieter. The empire still stood, but its foundation was built on ghosts. And in the stillness of the coastal wind, there were nights when he swore he could hear two voices, not one, calling from the cliffs. One begging for forgiveness, the other offering it. Luna's child grew under the name Grace Spencer, unaware of the storm that had delivered her into the world. She had her father's gentleness and her mother's fire, an impossible balance that both healed and haunted those around her. To Bill, she was proof that something pure could survive the wreckage of sin. To Katie, she was a second chance. But to those who knew the truth, she was something more complicated, a living testament to the fact that, even in death, Luna had the last word. And perhaps that was the cruelest mercy of all. Because no matter how far the Spencers tried to run from the darkness of their bloodline, it always found its way home. The baby on the doorstep had not only rewritten their fate, she had reminded them that redemption, once stained by obsession and silence, can never come without a price, and sometimes, that price is everything you love.